The chamber was loud, voices colliding in a storm of words that no one truly heard. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her tone sharp, her hands slicing through the air as if command itself came from her volume. The room bristled with tension, aides shifting in their seats, cameras whirring to capture every second of the escalating clash. But then, at the height of Crockett's rising voice, something unexpected happened. Kamala Harris did not lean in. She did not raise her voice. She simply lifted her hand, steady, deliberate, and with a calm smile that seemed to still the air itself, she cut the Congresswoman mid-sentence. The sound of Crockett's words died as if someone had pulled the plug on her microphone. Silence fell. A silence so sharp it felt cinematic, like the moment before the final verdict in a trial. Eyes darted. Aides froze. Journalists instinctively leaned closer, pens hovering above notepads. Crockett blinked, caught off guard, her usual rhythm breaking under the weight of that gesture. Harris's smile lingered, not mocking, not aggressive, but calm, disarming in its confidence, devastating in its timing. The cameras zoomed closer, catching the flicker of uncertainty across Crockett's face. Her hands, once cutting through the air, now faltered mid-gesture as the realization spread. She had lost the room. The calm presence beside her had seized it without a raised voice, without a single insult, without even finishing a sentence. It was not just an interruption. It was a moment that felt rehearsed by history itself, as if every courtroom Harris had commanded, every debate she had endured, every silence she had turned into strength, all had prepared her for this exact instant. The audience could feel it. That subtle shift, when authority no longer belongs to the one shouting, but to the one waiting. The room leaned toward Harris now, eyes on her, breath held. Crockett, for the first time, seemed small in her own storm, and then, just as the tension threatened to break, Harris opened her mouth, her voice steady, her words about to slice through the air with the precision of a scalpel. This was the moment everyone in the chamber, and later, millions online, would never forget. But what she said next would send shockwaves across the nation. To understand why that single smile and lifted hand carried so much weight, we have to rewind. The chamber had been restless from the start of the session. It wasn't just another congressional meeting. It was one of those rare hearings where the stakes reached beyond policy into the soul of the nation. The atmosphere was thick with expectation. Reporters whispered about how the hearing would play online. Politicians rehearsed their sound bites. And the audience sensed that this wasn't merely another exchange of ideas. It was a test of dignity, identity, and power. Jasmine Crockett entered the stage as if she owned it. Her reputation preceded her, fiery, unapologetic, unyielding. For some, she embodied defiance against the establishment. For others, she symbolized the worst kind of politics, noise without nuance, heat without light. And on this day, she wasted no time proving both sets of opinions true. From the very start, Crockett's words cut sharply, almost daring anyone to interrupt her. She leaned into the microphone, voice rising, speaking over colleagues who tried to make measured points. Every pause was quickly filled with her own rebuttals, every question turned into a monologue. Some members shifted uncomfortably, others rolled their eyes, but no one could quite match her force. She thrived on chaos, feeding off the attention, commanding the spotlight with sheer volume. Yet sitting just a few seats away, Kamala Harris embodied the opposite. Calm, collected, her face unreadable as Crockett pressed harder, talking faster, cutting through the air with relentless conviction. Harris didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't even shift in her chair. Instead, she watched, she listened, and she waited. The contrast was striking. Crockett seemed to battle the air itself, pushing against invisible opponents, while Harris seemed to gather strength from stillness. It was the difference between a storm and a mountain, one raging wildly, the other unmoved, waiting for the storm to pass, and that difference mattered. Because this wasn't just about two women in a room. This was about what their clash represented to millions watching at home. On one side, the noise of politics as performance, interrupting, dominating, drowning out. On the other, the promise of leadership as dignity, steady, deliberate, controlled. The chamber became a mirror of the national conversation. What kind of leadership does America need? Whose voice truly carries weight? The one that shouts the loudest? or the one that waits for the right moment to speak. As Crockett's energy climbed, some aides exchanged glances, as if silently asking, "When will this end?" Others leaned into their phones, already drafting texts to reporters about the chaos unfolding. The cameras focused tightly on Crockett's movements, her sharp gestures, her rising inflection. But another lens, a subtler one, caught Harris in her quiet power, her eyes trained forward, her lips pressed in a knowing line. Harris's silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Every second Crockett overplayed her hand, Harris's eventual response grew stronger in the minds of those who waited for it. And in politics, timing is everything. The moment was building, brick by brick, word by word, until the chamber itself seemed to hold its breath. Crockett, convinced she was controlling the narrative, only amplified the suspense. Harris, by doing nothing at all, became the center of it. Because Harris had been here before, she had faced down louder voices, more hostile rooms, and harsher interrogations. She knew the cost of speaking too soon. She knew the value of waiting until the exact moment when the interruption would not just silence words, but shatter arrogance. And in that room, on that day, Kamala Harris knew exactly when to strike. Jasmine Crockett did not stumble into the spotlight. She raced into it with the force of a thunderclap. From the moment she arrived on the political stage, she cultivated a reputation as someone unafraid to say what others would not. Her words cut sharp, her cadence quick and unforgiving, her energy relentless. To her supporters, this made her a fighter. To her critics, it made her a bully. Either way, Crockett understood something crucial. Attention is the currency of politics, and she was determined to spend it lavishly. On camera, she was magnetic. She spoke with the pace of a litigator and the ferocity of a street activist, whipping her words like weapons. In interviews, she rarely let questions breathe before steamrolling into answers that sounded more like indictments than reflections. On social media, she thrived, embracing the aesthetics of combat. The clipped video takedown, the viral clapback, the perfectly packaged soundbite meant to circulate in loops across timelines. Crockett seemed less interested in dialogue than domination. That domination often came at a cost. She interrupted colleagues mid-sentence, derailed discussions with grandstanding speeches, and treated hearings like stages where her voice had to be the only one heard. She thrived in the chaos she created, turning disorder into her brand. Those who agreed with her saw it as refreshing honesty. Those who didn't saw it as arrogance dressed in activism. Her persona, fiery and unapologetic, was built on contradiction. She positioned herself as a champion of fairness, yet she often silenced the very voices she claimed to defend. She spoke about democracy, yet weaponized disruption in a way that made process feel irrelevant. She demanded dignity, yet her tone carried contempt for anyone who dared oppose her. And in the modern political theater, contradiction is not weakness, it is spectacle. Crockett knew spectacle. She wielded it like armor. Still, spectacle can be double-edged. The louder she grew, the more she drew attention to herself, the more she risked alienating those who wanted not just heat but light. In the age of viral moments, every second on camera could birth a meme, a hashtag, or a headline. Crockett leaned into this risk, certain that force alone would bend perception in her favor. But perception is tricky. What energized her base simultaneously repelled those craving a different kind of leadership. For every cheer online, there was a sigh in the chamber. For every retweet celebrating her fire, there was an eye roll from colleagues who felt drowned out by her noise. This was the paradox at the core of Crockett's rise. She craved validation from disruption. But disruption eventually exhausts the very audience it captivates. The congressional session that day showcased her contradictions in full. As others spoke with careful emphasis, Crockett darted in with interruptions, challenging points before they could be completed. Her energy was electric, but it grated too. It filled the room with tension, turning dialogue into duel. Her presence was not collaborative, it was combative, and that was precisely her comfort zone. Crockett believed control belonged to the loudest. If she could keep talking, keep hammering, keep drowning out, she could win, not by persuasion, but by sheer force of presence. For a time it worked. Cameras captured her dominance. The sound of her voice ruled the room. Colleagues shrank in her shadow, but there was one person who did not shrink. One person who did not rush to match her fire with fire. One person who did not mistake silence for surrender. Kamala Harris sat in that chamber as if she had seen it all before. And in a way she had. Harris had faced louder voices than Crockett's. She had stared down more chaotic storms. She had learned through trial after trial that true power doesn't always come from filling the air. It comes from knowing when to clear it. Crockett thrived in a theater of noise, but she didn't yet realize she was stepping into an arena where silence could be sharper than sound. She didn't yet recognize the danger of overplaying her hand in front of someone who understood timing better than anyone. Because Crockett thought she was wrestling with colleagues, sparring with process, battling with bureaucracy. She didn't yet realize she was walking into a collision with something far stronger. A calm so deliberate it could silence even her most relentless storm. But Crockett didn't yet realize who she was up against. To understand why Kamala Harris's interruption carried such seismic weight, you have to know where she came from. Her composure in that chamber was not an accident. It was the product of a life forged in two worlds, shaped by two immigrant parents who believed in the promise of America and instilled in their daughter the values of dignity, persistence, and justice. Born in Oakland, California, Harris grew up at the intersection of cultures and struggles. Her mother, Shyamala, had crossed oceans from India, carrying little more than her brilliance and determination to study science. Her father, Donald, had come from Jamaica with a passion for economics and a conviction that ideas could transform societies. In their household, the talk of sacrifice, justice, and identity wasn't abstract. It was daily life. As a child, Harris learned quickly that her world would not hand her respect. She would have to claim it. She saw her mother rise before dawn, pushing forward in a country that often doubted women like her. She heard her father's words about fairness and history, lessons that stayed with her long after childhood. From them, Harris absorbed something Crockett never seemed to grasp. True authority doesn't come from shouting. It comes from living with discipline, holding your ground, and choosing your moments wisely. Those lessons followed her into the courtroom. As a prosecutor, Harris often stood in rooms where tempers flared, where defense attorneys threw sharp words like daggers, where witnesses faltered under pressure. Yet she never let the storm dictate her stance. Colleagues remember her poise, the way she paused before responding, the way silence itself became her weapon. She didn't need to yell to dismantle an argument. She needed precision, timing, and calm. In trial after trial, she demonstrated that the loudest lawyer was not always the most effective. The most deliberate one was. Her persistence was legendary. When doors closed, she knocked again. When critics underestimated her, she refused to bend. From the courtroom to the Senate to the vice presidency, Harris carried the same rhythm, steady, strategic, unshaken. While others thrived on theatrics, she thrived on results. It was a different kind of power, one that resonated deeply with people who knew what it meant to wait, to endure, to rise without shouting. And that was what made her such a contrast to Jasmine Crockett. Crockett's energy burned fast and hot, like a firework dazzling for an instant before fading. Harris's energy was more like a river, steady, cutting deeper with time, impossible to ignore even when quiet. In a world addicted to noise, Harris represented endurance. She embodied the dignity that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone drag you into chaos. Her immigrant roots gave her that resilience. She knew the weight of being doubted, dismissed, overlooked. She knew what it was like to stand in spaces where her identity itself was questioned. Yet she also knew the strength of carrying her ancestors' sacrifices on her shoulders. Every time she walked into a chamber, she carried not just her own story, but the stories of millions who believed that patience, persistence, and dignity could still shape America. It was no coincidence. Then, that Harris did not rush to battle Crockett in that chamber. She didn't rise to the bait of interruption with interruption. She didn't let her opponent drag her into the theater of volume. Instead, she let Crockett expend her energy, allowed the storm to rage, and waited for the silence that would inevitably come. It was a strategy she had mastered in courtrooms long before she ever entered politics. Let the noise burn itself out, then speak when the world is finally listening. And so, as Crockett filled the air with her interruptions, Harris's stillness became louder than any speech. Her quiet presence reminded the room of something larger, that dignity is not passive, it is powerful. That calm is not weakness, it is mastery. And that when arrogance overreaches, composure has the ability to dismantle it without effort. This was not new to Harris. She had stood in these storms before. She had faced voices that doubted her, dismissed her, tried to talk over her. And every time she had leaned into the lessons her parents had given her. Hold your ground, choose your moment, and let your presence speak louder than their noise. That is why the interruption mattered. It wasn't just a political maneuver. It was a lifetime condensed into one gesture, a raised hand, a calm smile, the distilled power of decades of persistence. It was the immigrant's daughter reminding America that the most enduring strength is not in volume, but in composure. Crockett's fire had made the chamber restless, but Harris's calm was about to redefine it. The tension had reached its peak. The storm had raged long enough. And Harris, steady and deliberate, knew the time had come. And when the moment came, Harris did not raise her voice. She simply raised the room. The chamber grew heavier with every passing minute. Crockett, emboldened by the sound of her own voice, pressed harder. She spoke not just to make points, but to dominate the air itself, layering interruption upon interruption until even the stenographers struggled to capture the chaos. Her words rolled fast and sharp like a storm that refused to move on, and each time a colleague tried to step in, she raised her volume, dismissing their arguments as if they were background noise. Her energy was electric, but it was also suffocating. Every pause turned into a monologue. Every challenge dissolved under the weight of her constant rebuttals. She leaned forward with conviction, jabbing the air with her finger, convinced that if she never let up, she would own the stage entirely. Cameras tracked her every movement, capturing the fire in her gestures, the clipped edges of her speech. To some it was thrilling. To others it was exhausting, and through it all, Kamala Harris remained still, her hands clasped loosely before her shoulders straight but relaxed, her gaze fixed with quiet intensity. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't smirk, didn't flinch. She simply watched. Every insult, every interruption, every boastful jab. Harris absorbed it like a mountain absorbs wind. She wasn't cowed. She was calculating. That composure began to change the energy in the room. Colleagues who had been restless now looked to Harris almost unconsciously, as if waiting for her to cut through the noise. Even the cameras, though still capturing Crockett's theatrics, lingered on Harris's stillness, as though sensing the inevitability of what was coming. It was as if the room itself was bracing, holding its breath for the moment when silence would finally give way to something sharper. But Crockett couldn't see it. In her mind, she was winning. She had the floor. She had the volume. She had the cameras. Her rhythm, her dominance, her sheer presence. She believed it all meant control. She mistook the silence around her for surrender, not realizing it was actually anticipation. Every courtroom Harris had ever commanded had taught her the truth. The louder one side grows, the more powerful silence becomes. Let your opponent spend their energy. Let them overextend. Let them reveal their own arrogance. Then, when the storm is at its loudest, step in with calm precision. That was the art Harris had perfected, so she waited. She let Crockett's voice climb higher, let her drown out yet another colleague, let her twist her own performance into overexposure. And with each passing second, the suspense deepened. What would Harris say? When would she move? Could calm really hold against chaos? The audience, both in the chamber and beyond, leaned closer. They might not have known it consciously, but they were already shifting allegiance. They were already weary of the storm. They were ready for the silence to finally speak. Crockett, however, carried on, convinced that the room was hers. She spoke as though she was untouchable, as though her words alone defined the debate. And in that very confidence, she revealed her weakness. She didn't understand that control isn't claimed by noise, it's earned by timing. And Harris, with her calm smile and steady gaze, knew exactly when to take it back. Because Kamala Harris was not silent out of weakness. She was silent out of strategy. It happened in an instant, and yet the room seemed to stretch into eternity. Jasmine Crockett's voice was rising again, her tone sharper, her gestures broader, her interruptions more relentless than ever. She leaned forward, chin lifted, her words spilling fast like a faucet left running. But then Kamala Harris moved. She didn't slam her hand on the table. She didn't raise her voice above the noise. She did something far more powerful. Harris lifted her hand ever so slightly, palm outward, a gesture at once polite and commanding. The effect was immediate. The air seemed to ripple. Crockett's words faltered, caught midstream as though the sheer weight of composure had stolen their momentum, and then came the smile. That calm, unshakable smile Harris had worn through courtrooms, Senate hearings, and campaign stages. It wasn't smug. It wasn't cruel. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly where this was going. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, measured, and unyielding. Congresswoman, the purpose of this chamber is not to see who can shout the loudest. It is to serve the people with dignity. If you cannot respect that, then perhaps you should reconsider why you're here. The words landed like thunder in a silent sky. They weren't shouted. They weren't delivered with fire. They were delivered with precision, like a scalpel cutting clean through noise. For the first time all day, Crockett froze. Her mouth opened slightly, searching for a retort that wouldn't come. She shifted in her seat, glanced to the side, then back again, blinking as if she had walked headfirst into a wall she hadn't seen. The arrogance that had fueled her voice just moments before drained into hesitation. The silence in the room grew deafening. No one interrupted. No one coughed. Even the shuffle of papers stopped. All eyes turned to Harris, still seated in perfect poise, hands now gently folded, smile unwavering. The power in the room had shifted, decisively and undeniably. Whispers began at the edges, tiny ripples in the quiet. A senator leaned to another, murmuring in acknowledgement. A staffer shook his head slowly, a grin tugging at his lips. Even some who had been skeptical of Harris found themselves nodding. The reaction wasn't explosive. It was collective, like a tide pulling everyone in the same direction. Crockett tried to recover, but every attempt fell flat. "Well, I was only—" she stammered, her words tripping over themselves. She attempted to inject her usual fire, but the force was gone. The contrast was too stark. Her volume against Harris's poise, her fluster against Harris's calm. For the first time, Crockett wasn't in control of her own performance. She had been outmaneuvered, not by louder words, but by quieter strength. The gasps came when Crockett finally fell silent, realizing she had nowhere to go. It wasn't that she had been silenced, it was that she had been defeated. And the room knew it. Even her harshest critics couldn't deny the mastery of the moment. Across the spectrum, Democrat, Republican, Independent, people acknowledged what had just unfolded. Some admired Harris's restraint, others admired her timing, but everyone recognized the skill. To command silence in a room built on noise is not an accident. It is a craft. The silence after Harris's words stretched on, almost unbearably. Every second felt like another hammer strike, solidifying the impact. Crockett shifted again, her face betraying flashes of frustration, then disbelief, then resignation. She attempted a small smile, but it looked forced, brittle. The contrast only deepened the blow. And Harris? She didn't gloat. She didn't add more. She simply let the silence work for her. That was the mic drop, not just the words, but the refusal to clutter them with anything more. The power of restraint became its own exclamation point. Viewers in the chamber weren't the only ones stunned. In the press gallery, journalists scrambled to jot down every syllable, every gesture, every pause. Cameras zoomed in on Crockett's frozen expression, then cut back to Harris's steady calm. In living rooms and offices across the country, millions would soon watch and rewatch the exchange, their reactions echoing the gasps in the chamber. It was one of those rare political moments where sides blurred. Supporters of Harris celebrated openly. Opponents of Harris, though reluctant, admitted she had landed a masterstroke. The exchange became more than an argument. It became a study in contrast, a lesson in how composure can shatter chaos. Crockett's allies would later try to spin it, framing her as passionate or unfiltered, but the damage was done. The viral clip told the story better than any spin could. Harris's smile, her hand raised, her words, short, sharp, impossible to forget. Crockett, scrambling, blinking, exposed. In the hours that followed, the conversation in the chamber stumbled forward, but no one truly heard it. The moment had already eclipsed the debate. Everyone present knew they had witnessed the highlight. It was as if history itself had paused to let Harris etch her mark. The cameras lingered as long as they could, capturing Harris's face as she leaned back slightly, her composure untouched, her authority cemented. The silence around her wasn't awkward anymore. It was reverent, but that silence was only the beginning, because the true explosion wasn't in the room. It was online. The clip hit the internet before most lawmakers had even left the chamber. A single video, 20 seconds long, captured everything. Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence, Kamala Harris lifting her hand with that calm smile, the room freezing, and then the words that silenced the noise. Within minutes, hashtags flooded the digital airwaves. Her Harris moment, her smile that shut the room. Composure wins. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, every platform became a stage replaying the same instant again and again. On TikTok, the edits began. Slow motion cuts of Harris's hand rising, set to dramatic orchestral music. Freeze frames of her smile, captions reading, "This is power." Memes surfaced almost instantly. Crockett compared to a Wi-Fi signal cutting out midstream. Harris as the calm buffering screen that reset the whole debate. Even teenagers who had never tuned into a congressional hearing shared clips, lip-syncing Harris's line about dignity, turning it into a rallying cry across generational lines. Cable news wasn't far behind. By evening, every network had their analysts lined up, dissecting the moment from every angle. CNN replayed the clip with slow pans, noting Harris's body language, her timing, her ability to command without force. MSNBC hailed it as a masterclass in composure. Even on Fox News, where commentators rushed to defend Crockett, the admission was unavoidable. Harris had landed the cleaner, sharper blow. Pundits spent hours debating what exactly had made the exchange so devastating. Some argued it was Harris's restraint, the refusal to engage in Crockett's chaos. Others said it was her choice of words, framing dignity against noise. But one point was unanimous. Harris's smile had done more damage than 1,000 angry speeches could. It became a symbol, a shorthand for strength under fire. And beyond the talking heads, ordinary viewers found themselves galvanized. For immigrants, for women of color, for anyone who had ever been spoken over or dismissed, the clip was validation. Comments poured in, "That's my VP." She spoke for every one of us who's been interrupted. Strength isn't shouting, it's knowing when to silence the noise. For Harris's supporters, the moment wasn't just political, it was personal. They shared stories of being overlooked, interrupted in classrooms, ignored in boardrooms, drowned out in family arguments. Harris's poise had given those experiences a voice, proving that calm could be revolutionary. Meanwhile, Crockett's camp scrambled. Her defenders on social media insisted she had been passionate, that Harris had been condescending, that the moment was being exaggerated. But the viral machinery was unstoppable. For every excuse, there were 10 more memes. For every attempted spin, there was another clip replaying Harris's hand rising, her smile unshaken. In the broader political landscape, the exchange fed into narratives already in play. For Democrats, it was a reminder of Harris's strength, an image they were eager to amplify as a contrast to the chaos of political opponents. For Republicans, it was a tricky moment. Even those eager to attack Harris had to navigate the undeniable optics. To deny the impact was to appear blind. To acknowledge it was to admit she had triumphed. The media latched on to the symbolism. Editorials described it as the calm in the storm, a defining moment of political theater, even the smile heard around the world. Cartoonists sketched Harris as a towering figure of composure, Crockett shrinking in her shadow. Late-night comedians replayed the clip, joking that Crockett had crashed like a bad Zoom call, while Harris simply pressed mute with her eyebrows. But beneath the noise, beneath the hashtags, the memes, the talking heads, something deeper was brewing. Viewers weren't just entertained, they were inspired. The moment had touched on something larger than one exchange in one chamber. It had revealed a contrast not just between two women, but between two visions of leadership, one rooted in volume, the other in values. And that's why the clip didn't fade after a single news cycle. It lingered, it grew, it became a cultural reference point, shorthand for how dignity can dismantle arrogance, how silence can echo louder than shouting. Yet even as the laughter spread online and the commentary thickened on air, one truth rose above it all. This wasn't just about a debate. It was about a lesson. And beyond the noise, there was a deeper message waiting to be uncovered. In the end, what lingered was not the clash of voices, not the sharpness of Crockett's interruptions, but the stillness that followed Harris's hand in the air. That moment became a prism through which millions saw something bigger than politics. They saw the eternal contest between arrogance and dignity, and the quiet triumph of dignity itself. Harris's interruption was never about silencing for its own sake. It was about reclaiming space from the chaos, about demonstrating that composure can be sharper than any insult. She had not raised her voice. She had not shouted down her opponent. Instead, she embodied the truth that in a time of shouting, calm is the loudest voice. It struck a universal chord. For every immigrant family that had taught their children to carry themselves with respect in the face of prejudice, Harris's smile felt like vindication. For every young professional told to wait their turn while louder voices filled the room, her poise was a model of power. For every citizen disillusioned by the noise of modern politics, the moment reminded them that clarity and conviction still mattered. In that silence after her words, Harris had offered more than a rebuttal. She had offered a blueprint, a reminder that justice does not need to roar, it only needs to stand firm. That arrogance, no matter how loud, eventually folds under the weight of truth delivered with grace. That real strength is not in domination but in restraint, not in belittling but in elevating. The lesson resonated far beyond the chamber. Teachers shared the clip with students as an example of composure. Clergy wove it into sermons about humility and strength. Parents played it for their children, saying, "This is how you win without losing yourself." It became a symbol of what leadership ought to be. Not performance, but presence. And perhaps that is why even critics struggled to dismiss it. They could argue policy, they could question strategy, but they could not deny the power of what had unfolded. Because the moment was not only political, it was profoundly human. For those who watched, the memory lingers. The poised hand, the calm smile, the words that cut through the clamor. It was a reminder that dignity is not fragile. It does not tremble before arrogance. It does not wither under attack. Dignity waits, it watches, and when the time comes, it silences noise without becoming noise itself. That is the moral Harris offered, not through lecture, but through example. That in the storms of our era, when shouting feels endless and outrage seems permanent, the answer may not be to outshout the chaos, but to outlast it. To embody a strength so unshakable that arrogance crumbles against it. And for millions, that message was not just inspiring. It was personal. It reminded them of who they were and who they could be. Because in the end, what silenced the room that day was not Harris's words alone. It was what they represented: justice, composure, and truth. And those, no matter how long they are tested, will always outlast arrogance. The lesson hung in the air like a promise, echoing beyond the chamber walls, carried in every replay, every share, every whispered conversation about the power of calm. It was more than a political moment. It was a moral one, and when the dust of the noise settles, it is those moments that remain. And so, it all comes back to that single, unforgettable image, the calm smile that cut through the storm. Kamala Harris raising her hand, steady and unshaken, as Jasmine Crockett's voice faltered. That was the moment that defined the exchange, the moment that silenced a room and later electrified millions across the nation. It wasn't just politics. It was a reminder of who we are and who we want to be. In a time when noise often drowns out truth, Harris showed us that composure isn't weakness, it's strength. That dignity doesn't retreat, it rises. And that justice, when paired with patience, has a way of shining brighter than arrogance ever could. This is why the clip has spread far beyond the chamber, beyond the headlines, beyond even politics itself. Because at its heart, it speaks to something universal. The immigrant who built a life with quiet persistence, the parent teaching their child to hold their head high, the citizen who refuses to lose faith in a democracy tested by division. They all saw themselves in that smile, and now the moment is in your hands. If dignity matters to you, if you believe calm can be louder than chaos, share this story, pass it on. Let it remind others that there is still strength in restraint, still hope in justice, still power in grace. This was more than a debate. It was a declaration that Americanness isn't about who shouts the loudest, but who stands tallest. That our future doesn't belong to arrogance, but to composure. And with that smile, Harris didn't just shut the room. She opened a path forward for all of us,